Okay, so we left off talking about the electron transport chain, and I just want to remind you that this is exactly like we learned it in Chapter 7 with photosynthesis. The electron transport chain works the same way, whether it's in the chloroplast or whether it's in the mitochondria. The mechanics of it are identical. So you have the flow of electrons, that would be step one. The flow of electrons through that electron transport chain, through those protein complexes. And the flow of electrons releases energy. Then that energy is used to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane, out of the matrix into what we call the intermembrane space. That builds up a concentration gradient of a high concentration of hydrogen ions. So when they encounter ATP synthase, the hydrogen ions flow back through it. And the flow of those charged hydrogen ions releases the energy that's needed to produce the ATP. All of that I just described is called chemiosmosis. It's ATP production that is linked to the establishment of the hydrogen ion gradient. And what establishes that gradient is the flow of electrons down the electron transport chain. So, really, the best way to understand it is to take this picture and just talk through, be able to explain it to someone else. You know, here you've got this from this orange molecule here. Okay, so electrons are passed from here to here to here to here. So you see that with these electrons. That flow of electrons is what gives the energy to pump hydrogen out. And hydrogen builds up out here in this intermembrane space, and then it flows down its concentration gradient through that ATP synthase, and that is what makes ATP. If you can trace it and talk about it at the same time that you are pointing to the structures, you know, in the illustration here, then that's the way you understand it, okay? So let's talk about the energy yield from glucose metabolism. So when we have one molecule of glucose, during cellular respiration, we get 2 ATPs from glycolysis, 2 from the citric acid cycle, and 32 or 34 from the electron transport chain. Oh, this is one I didn't highlight, but the energy efficiency is 39%. And if you know anything about like machines, that's huge. 39% energy efficient is really, really energy efficient. So this is a diagram that shows all of the processes that occur during cellular respiration, and it kind of gives you an idea of where the ATP that's made and also how it's made. So we've got 2 ATPs produced directly from glycolysis, 2 ATPs produced directly from the citric acid cycle. That comes out to 4. Then from glycolysis, remember there were 2 NADHs produced. PrEP reaction, which is this part in here, it's not labeled, but this is the PrEP reaction, produces 2 more NADHs. Citric acid cycle produces 6 NADHs and then 2 FADH2s. So here's what you do. If you want to know how much ATP is coming from the NADH or the FADH2, each NADH, you multiply that by 3 because an NADH will make 3 ATPs. So we say 2 times 3, and that's where we get this 6 from. Sometimes it's 4, but we're going to go with 6 just because it's easier to do it this way. Then we have 2 more NADHs times 3 gives you 6 ATPs. 6 NADHs gives you 18. 2 FADH2s. Now each FADH2 only can produce 2 ATPs. So we'll get 4 out of them. When you add these numbers up, 6 plus 6 is 12 plus 18, that gives you 30. And then 4 gives you 34. So that's where you get your 34 ATPs from the electron transport chain. And then you add that to the 4 from glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, and that will give you 38 ATPs. Due to some chemical reasons, chemistry type, reasons that I'm not going to go into, You can Google it if you would like, but sometimes you don't get 38, you only get 36. But there is a reason behind that. But for the most part, the way that I've explained it to you, that's really probably the best way, for our purposes anyway. Every NADH will make 3 ATPs, and every FADH2 will make 2. Now, let's talk about metabolism a little bit, and we'll wrap up this chapter. So, foods that we eat are sources of energy-rich molecules, and the food groups are going to be carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And when these foods break down, we call that catabolism. And catabolism reactions tend to be exergonic. They tend to release energy and produce ATP. Then we have the synthetic reactions. What that means is these reactions build molecules, and that will be called anabolism. The reactions that build molecules tend to be endergonic. That means you need energy. These reactions consume energy. And so we eat the food, break down the food into its basic components, and then we use the energy and some of the molecules from the food to build other molecules that we need for our body, like enzymes and hormones and muscle tissue, different things like that. This diagram, and this is where I'm going to stop. This diagram on slide 33 shows you, like, here's your pizza, and you get proteins from the cheese and the pepperoni. You get carbohydrates from the, there are some sugars in the sauce, and then there's the bread, there's the pizza crust. And then, of course, you get fats. They're all the grease, that's in the pizza. The proteins are broken down by catabolism into amino acids. Now, amino acids can enter cellular respiration. They can be converted to pyruvate and enter glycolysis. They can be converted to acetyl-CoA and enter the citric acid cycle, or they can also be converted to other components of the citric acid cycle. So, amino acids can enter cellular respiration in different ways. Glucose enters and starts glycolysis from step 1. Carbohydrates are broken down into glucose, okay? Then fats are broken down into glycerol and fatty acids. So the glycerol can be converted into pyruvate and enter glycolysis that way. The fatty acids can be converted to acetyl-CoA and enter the citric acid cycle. So all of the types of foods that we eat, all of the types of nutrients, macromolecules that we consume, can enter cellular respiration at some point in the cycle and produce ATP. We just usually talk about cellular respiration beginning with glucose because that's just the most common way, So anyway, then you can look at the arrows that are moving up because we need to build some of these molecules. We need proteins for all kinds of things, proteins for muscle tissue, proteins for the little membrane proteins that we have in our plasma membrane, like carriers and channels and receptor proteins. So when we need those, our body has to make them. Enzymes are proteins. So every time we need enzymes, our body has to make them. Okay. So the same thing, carbohydrates. Remember the carbohydrate chains on the surface of our cells that identify our cells to our immune system. So, and then fats, we have phospholipids that form our plasma membranes. We have cholesterol, which is a fat, triglycerides. So we have just body fat, and our body has to make that. So that's what the arrows pointing back to these molecules means. Okay, so that's the metabolic pool concept. And I'm going to end here.